Hi, Mike Brantley, auctioneer, discussing a series here, laws and how they affect auctioneers. And in this part one, we'll just kind of look at an overview here, whether we're talking about the federal government or state government or even to some extent local. There's basically three branches of government at the federal and state level. And looking at federal, for example, here we have Congress, the Senate, and the House. What do? They create laws. President in the federal level can sign or veto or pocket veto, just not respond. But largely the legislature is charged with creating laws. The president, the executive branch, the regulatory agencies under the executive branch, they enforce laws, police laws, essentially. And then third, and quite frequently, we look at the judicial branch of the government, and the judicial branch interprets laws. At the federal level, the U.S. Supreme Court is charged with seeing if laws are constitutional or not. Some state Supreme Courts, county courts, federal appeals courts do a touch more than that in terms of constitutionality, but largely is the law constitutional and can settle what's called circuit splits between circuit courts if there's disagreement, and or at the local level just decide, well, this is how we interpret this law. And that's exactly what some judges and juries around the United States do every day. Look over the law and say, well, this is how we interpret this, or this is how we read this law. And it's unfortunate, although maybe unavoidable, that some laws are just ambiguous. We're not clear what the law means. We're not clear what the drafters, what the legislature meant when they said this. There might be contradictory things. There might be one law over here that says this and one law over here that says that. And those both can't be true at the same time, for example. And so it's up to courts, it's up to judges, it's up to juries in part to decide, well, this is what we think this law means, or this is how we believe this law should be applied. I wrote about a case in a New York court that viewed a contract as unreasonable, unfair, inequitable, largely. And some might look at that and say, well, now, wait a minute. We don't want courts looking at laws saying that's unfair or unreasonable, inequitable. That's not the job of the court. And I would argue, no, it is the job of the court. The court looks at that law and says, well, that law doesn't make sense, or that law isn't reasonable. That's what courts do. That's what all courts do. And so auctioneers have to pay attention to not only what the written law says on the legislative side, what literally the law says word for word, and of course that requires some interpretation by the auctioneer, typically, how it's regulated, how it's applied. I'll give you a quick example. In my home state, there is a rule/law that says for certain licensees, when they sit down with a client, sign a contract, engage as an agent for that client, that they sign paperwork, that they're given copies, the client is given copies of that paperwork in real time, immediately, or at the moment. Now, what if they don't give copies at the moment, but I say, I don't have a copy machine here, my phone's not functioning properly. I'm going to run back to the office. It'll be about 10 minutes. I'll scan them in, email them to you. Is that okay? And largely the regulatory arm has said, well, that's how we're going to interpret that law. Even though I think you could make that argument that the law says that you can't take 10 minutes, but you've got to give it to them right away. What's right away mean? Oh, good question, maybe, right? Right away as in immediately, within a minute, within 2 minutes, within 3 minutes. How do we get into situations like this? Well, the legislature doesn't write the law necessarily clearly. And so the regulatory agency takes a stab at interpreting. They have their interpretation. And then if there's a complaint or a lawsuit or a claim filed, then attorneys get into court, and attorney on one side is going to say, well, I interpret, or I think, Your Honor, I think you should see that this law says this, versus the other attorney on the other side probably saying to the judge or jury, Your Honor, I think you should look at it this way. And who do we have in that courtroom who's using his or her interpretive powers to then decide what that law means? We have the judge and or the jury. So there's interpretation of laws, whether it be at the legislature, what they mean or how they interpret it. The regulatory agency may interpret it differently, sometimes substantially differently. And then the courts look at that law and use their interpretive power or their feelings or their thinking as to what's reasonable, what's fair, what was the intent. Courts use not that it always divides into two pieces here, but courts oftentimes will use what's called a textualist interpretative process. This is what the drafters of the law meant 75 years ago. When that law was written, this is what they meant, and so we're going to apply that today. Other people say, well, now wait a minute. That law was written 75 years ago. They didn't know about circumstances here today in today's society, and so we're going to apply or grade that law based on what we know today. And so judges, oftentimes the U.S. Supreme Court, it's not unusual to see a split between, a 5-4 split or a 6-3 split, that the one side's interpreting it on a textual basis and the other side's interpreting it as an interpretive, progressive, let's look at today's environment and apply the law as best we can. So to suggest that people aren't involved in laws, how they're created, how they're enforced, how they're interpreted, that people are involved in that entire process. There's no process at all. Laws don't mean anything without interpretation and without enforcement and associated interpretation, and the legislature and their interpretation of what they're writing. Contracts and the like, terms and conditions for auctioneers in particular, can be ambiguous in places. We can have something over here that says this and something over here that says that, and you can't have this and that at the same time. So it's either this or that. They can be patently ambiguous, obviously ambiguous, or they can be more latent in their ambiguity. Not necessarily obvious to the person or people involved in the contract, but you get a third party to look at it and they say, well, it's not clear to me what you meant, versus patently ambiguous. Almost anybody that looked at it would say, well, this just doesn't make any sense. It's irreconcilable. You can't have both these things at the same time. So lawmaking is messy. Maybe I should say that. Legislatures do an admirable job, Congress, state legislators, etc., in creating laws. Regulatory agencies have to create rules to accompany those laws. And, well, they do an admirable job, but there's always holes. There's always things they didn't think about. On the regulatory side, whether that be the president, a governor, regulatory agency, administrative agency, they do an admirable job trying to interpret or trying to make sense of the law in a practical, boots on the ground, hands out, type process. And the courts are left to handle disputes when parties say, well, this law I think means this, and this another attorney or party says, no, I think it means that. Then courts are charged with interpreting and settling those kinds of disputes to arrive at a solution, some sort of answer to that complaint. Here's how we're going to rule, and then those rulings here in the United States develop what we call case law. In other words, we have a case, and that case produces, in essence, more law. And the argument's made, and I think rightly so, and I don't know that this is broken necessarily, but courts not only interpret law, but make law. Because if they interpret it somewhere differently, that's in essence the new law they will all have to follow. So I encourage auctioneers, as I preach in pre-licensing classes and for auctioneers getting continuing education or what have you around the United States. Anytime I'm talking to a group, I say, guys, gals, you got to look at the laws as written, how the regulatory agency interprets or applies it, and have there been any court cases which have countered or interpreted differently than the regulatory agency and or the legislature. You got to keep all doors open, so to speak, when you're looking at law, analyzing law, and seeing how it applies to you as an auctioneer or anyone else for that matter. Mike Brandley, auctioneer. Pleasure to be with you today. Other videos on this same page, others forthcoming. Have a great day and stay safe.